Hi and welcome to another episode of the Bonsai Stuff podcast. If you don't know who I am, I'm Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu. If you listen to the podcast, you would have heard my voice a few times. Thank you for tuning in. It's greatly appreciated as always. And I want to start this podcast with a special shout out to an avid listener named Matt who entered a Seiju Elm into a show, the Braidwood show, and he took out Grand Champion. Now, this is really important because I think that putting your trees on, or aiming to get your trees on display, as I've talked about many times in the podcast, is a great target for all of us. And it's daunting putting yourself out there, but when you do it and you get the chocolates, or you get your tree to another level, which is the most important part. You know, you push yourself and you push your tree, and your planning has to be spot on. Everything has to work out well. You know, it deserves a little bit of recognition. So well done, Matt. Anyway, in this podcast, I want to talk about Cedars. As I mentioned at the end of last podcast, I've been doing a bit of work on Cedars lately. It's a good time of the year for me to get into them. We've just ticked over to early autumn or fall, depending on where you are. But early autumn for me is a really nice period of time because things start to change around the yard. You know, the trees start to start heading towards that dormancy period. There's still a bit of an initial flush of growth. So there's still a bit happening around the yard. There's still a bit of growth you've got to manage. But the overnight temperatures start to cool down. The trees start to slow down, start to catch up on their rest that they're going to need through getting through the hotter heat of summer. And I think that, you know, there are still warm places around Australia, but in Melbourne, we've got a few little spikes underway of temperature, but pretty much things feel like they're starting to cool down a little bit now, which is really nice. You know, these crisp, cool mornings, walking around, having a coffee, looking at my trees, you can feel it in the air. It's starting to get a bit cooler. So autumn's a good time because that's when we can do a hell of a lot of fertilising. And I know that we're starting to push towards pine season as well, which for me makes me smile and sends a shiver up my spine at the same time because there's a hell of a lot of work that I'm going to have to do. But to get to that period, you know, I need to know with my fertilising of my pines, which is a really important time, especially for black pines after decandling. This autumn fertilising is super important for building their strength because they've sort of been fed, flogged with being decandled, and now they've been left, and now they need to build their strength up again to get through dormancy, so when spring comes around, everything takes off again. Otherwise, they can sort of keep taking this bit of a backward step. So I want to talk in the podcast too also about knowing when, you know, getting your head around preparing for pine maintenance. That's a big thing to start to work around. And the other one that I want to talk about is this concept I've got called the bud conveyor, which is a method that of growing and pruning and maintenance and structuring of your trees that we all know about, we've all talked about on the podcast, but it's the reason why we do it and how we can sort of look to maintain a familiarity of bonsai design. It can never say truly static, but that's a future podcast, but it can never say truly static, but we can sort of look to do as much as we can to keep it where it is with this concept I call the bud conveyor. So let's get into it. Cedars, what a magnificent species. I seriously love them. I think they've got a hell of a lot going for them when it comes to bonsai. Very similar to a lot of other species, you know, spruce and that sort of thing, but the cedars themselves in Australia, readily available in most places. It's a broad statement, I know, but in most places they're readily available. Overseas, I've seen them in New Zealand, used over there a lot as well, and I think that the way they grow, the characteristics of the trees, there's a lot to love about them, a hell of a lot to love about them. There's a you know bit to learn with them as well. And that's why I thought I'd just share some thoughts, because after doing some work recently, which a lot of people have seen on Instagram and YouTube, work on a blue Atlantic cedar, blue Atlas cedar, there's been a lot of questions, a lot of comments, and how do you do this, and what about this, and what about that? So I thought it's a great forum to I suppose, air a few of those things and talk about what I do with them. One of the things with cedars that I want to start with is grafts. Now, a lot of them, if not all that I've seen, have grafts, and those grafts, when they're young, can be can possibly be a little bit ugly. Is that the right word? Not attractive to the eye. Let's not say ugly. Let's say they're not attractive. But what I've found with a lot of the cedar grafts is that over time, the grafts blend in really well to the point that as they get really, really old, you don't tend to notice them. And that's a plus. It's a really big plus that they sort of just blend in. You sort of go, is that the graft? Is that the graft? I'm not sure. Is that the graft? No, it's here. It's not like some of the other species I've seen grafted where they sort of stand out like a sore thumb, like white pine, for instance. You know, sometimes when they're grafted, you can really see it to the point that it's just like, God, this tree is going to be nothing. You've got magnificent foliage, magnificent branch structure, but your graft's so ugly that, 50 years down the track, you're still going to be looking at this thing going, it's never going to catch up to the graft. Sometimes they do, but sometimes a lot that I've seen, they never seem to get there, whereas cedars, I think that the grafts tend to age well. So when you're looking at younger stock, don't let it be a key factor in you not choosing to invest your time and give your love to one of these cedars, because I think that you'll be pleasantly surprised down the track. And don't forget that 10 years with bonsai is not very long. It goes in the blink of an eye. But I think you'll find that it blends in quite nicely and it's not a major issue. The other thing is needle quality for these. There's different varieties, and there's some that are more, in my personal experience, I've found that are more readily available, like the Himalayan cedar, for instance. It's got a scrappy needle, it's nice and blue in colour, and it seems to be the go-to for a lot of people when they first get cedars because they are readily available. They look like they've got lots of foliage. Nurseries love to pump them out because they grow so shaggily and look full. They're not my number one go-to because they take a lot of work to get them. And please don't think that I'm turning my back on them. I do love them. I've seen some beautiful ones. I've worked on a hell of a lot of beautiful ones that get there. But when you're looking for something which can give you a nice feel pretty quickly, or it can tend itself to not needing a lot of work or not making compromises on its structure, then I think the Himalayan cedar would be the one that I'd probably push towards the tail end of where we're at. Lebanese cedar, they're lovely, bloody sharp needles that seem to get under my skin and irritate the hell out of me. But they're really sharp needles. The Atlantic cedar is the one for me that I tend to go to. I think that they're lovely, green, blue, everything in between. They're my favourite. Blues are lovely. Where we are in Australia, I think that they're a draw card. They're beautiful. That grey blue foliage, powdery almost, that compares against the very dark branch structure that it gets. That contrast that it gives off it's like a painting, like something you'd see on the a wall somewhere in a Japanese castle. That's what I think draws a lot of people in, draws me in. And the needle quality on those is just lovely. It's really short, it's sharp. There are times where I've been shown and told, hey, look, you can get a short needle variety of these things. Generally, and again, this is my experience, it may be wrong, but in my experience, it's normally when they've been starved of nutrients and water that the needle length gets really, really small. It's not natural. The tree gets really weak and it suffers as a result. But all in all, I water well, I fertilise well, I repot, let's say, well. I give them everything that I possibly can, best positioning in the yard, love full sun. And my needle length on them is still in proportion to the size of the tree. Like they're not too short, they're not too long, they're just perfect for what I think when it comes to the size tree that I've generated out with that needle. So that withholding of nutrients for a cedar is not something that I'd promote, and I don't think it's very wise to do it for a tree in any form at any time where you're sacrificing health for aesthetically how it's going to appear in the needle length of the tree. So anyway, needle quality of the cedars is great, and that's something that I would look for when I'm hunting a new tree to put into my collection or to work on. It's you can sort of you can have branches grow, you can develop structure, you can cut trunks back, you can force taper, but the needle quality, same with most of our trees, the genetics of the tree really should be one of the key drivers when you're hunting through bonsai nurseries for what you want to look for. So just keep in mind that, if the needles look long and scrappy, then probably going to stay pretty much long and scrappy for the rest of the life of the tree. If they're nice and sharp and succinct, and when you look at I call them rosettes, but where the little buds are in the center of those needles and the needles sort of pop around that central bud, have a look and make sure that they're nice and uniform and they flow out nicely. And if you look at the video on YouTube where I do some needle plucking, explain how I needle pluck, you'll see why it's so important to get that nice ring of needles around the bud, because it sort of keeps everything together and makes it sit up nicely on top of the branch when you've cleaned the tree out. The other thing, when you're working with cedars, wiring is obviously needed. It's an essential part of developing your trees, but just be very careful. Those buds can knock off so easily. And as you get these sub-branches on your main branch and your secondary branching, those little ones are the ones that can knock off really, really easily. And it's something that you've got to take great care with. Never rush wiring a cedar. Obviously, younger trees, putting wire on there and pushing them down when those buds are still attached to the core branch, the primary branch, it's a lot easier. You don't have any extension of those little buds, haven't grown out anywhere. But when they start to grow out, they can tend to knock off really, really easy. So your wiring's got to be pretty much pinpoint. And I must admit, like with a lot of my trees, I'll wire the primary branches, maybe some of the secondaries, but that's it. I'm not going to go and wire the other stuff. I'll prune to make sure that I get it to the structure that I want without going overboard and wiring every single thing on every single tree, because I guarantee you with a cedar, if you wire right down to the tips, you're going to have all sorts of issues where things start to get knocked off. They do grow nice and thick because those buds sort of keep pushing out and keep pushing new needles every season, every growing season that you get. Every spring when they start to push and right the way through summer, you'll find that the needle density on these things starts to become a real issue because they'll become very congested around the buds. And when they start getting congested, I've found that you get lots of issues with caterpillars. They get in there, spiders get in there and make their little nests as well, which spiders aren't an issue. They're not going to hurt the tree. But when they start pulling all those needles in, that inner area that's not going to get light and air where the spiders tend to congregate, same as the caterpillars. Caterpillars will eat the new buds, but where they start to pull everything in together and make their little nest, their little cocoon, that area starts to die. So it's really important that you keep them open and airy. I generally tend to work on my cedars once to twice a year, depending on the growth rate that I've got. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. So what I do at this time of the year is just a final cleanup. Around late spring, early autumn, I like to get in there and look at the trees and go, all right, so you're about to head into dormancy period. I can give you a bit of a cleanup now. The growth I know is about to stop, so there's no point. I can wait a little bit longer, but I know what I've got just around the corner. I know that I've got pines coming up around the corner. So for me, I've finished my junipers. I've got my cedars right now that I can get into and say, well, I can give those long extensions a bit of a cutback. I can pluck out some of those needles, make sure that I get light and air in there as you're heading towards dormancy. Then spring comes around, all those new ones start to push out and grow again. Then after that, what I can do is I can, depending on the stage of the tree, I might be able to get in and start reducing some of those long shoots that happen, late spring, mid to late spring. I can do some work on those areas of the tree. But plucking really isn't a big issue because I know I've done the plucking way back when, which is sort of now. And this work can be done later. It can be pushed out towards, autumn, winter. That's no problem at all. But for me, I've got this opportunity where I've got a bit of a gap. I've finished my, natives, a lot of them have all been cut back. I've got pines coming up. So right now it's a great time for me to be getting in there and plucking. And plucking's really important with these things. If you don't want to keep up with the plucking on your cedars, then don't get them. And it multiplies out every year. You find that every time those buds grow, you're going to have buds that need to be plucked out. Generally, and this is a vast generalization, but once you get in there and you clean the unders of the branches, which we talk about, you clean the unders of the branches, that's pretty much done. So you don't have to keep doing that same job over and over. And the needle plucking does get a bit easier. It does get a bit more simplified in how you're doing, because sort of towards the tips, they're not going to be back budding on older wood, which is part of a problem with these things, is that lack of back budding in close to the trunk. So as these branches start to extend, you end up with a really long branch. And I find that it's this we're going to talk about the bud conveyor next, but having this plucking and opening up and allowing sunlight and air in there, so these other buds that are there can activate and continue to grow, buds that are further back on the branches. That's really important, and part of that process is through the plucking process, where we open it up and we let that sunlight and air in there. So it's really important, and the structure of the needles too. Like I talked about earlier, that when you pluck, you've got to make sure that you're keeping the structure of the needles that you're leaving first and foremost. All right. So what I mean by that is, where that bud is in the center, keep an even layer of needles around that, like a flower, right? So you want all the petals all the needles around this central bud, and have it lifting up or coming on an angle out towards you, not going down, but coming up and out towards you, like a 45-degree angle is nice. But so even if it's straight up on the branch to give you some volume on your pad, that still works with these things. But with your plucking, be very careful that you're not sort of taking out and leaving hollow gaps around that bud. Try and keep it that you're presenting that bud as neatly as you can. So it's the structure of the needles is really important. So moving on now to the pruning process. You get these spears that shoot out, and then you look at them and go, what do I do? Sometimes there's buds on there. Most times there's buds that you'll see on these new ones. Other times you look at it and go, well, really, there's no buds, but there's new growth. So let's work on the scenario where there's no buds, but there's new growth. With my approach with them, if it's a fresh bit of growth, if it's green, right? So if that shoot is still green and it's got new needles on there, I will look to reduce that back as much as I can, leave some of the new needles and make a cut, because you are almost always guaranteed of getting back budding in that area, because it's new. It's going to have all these dormant buds sitting in there. They're going to want to pop out as that branch tip gets removed. Oxen's going to be removed, so then you're going to find that those buds are going to start to take off. So that's the safest way of doing it. But I find as the trees become more and more advanced, those spears, unless I'm going to use them to lengthen a branch, unless I'm going to use them to advance the apex structure of the tree, pretty much 95% of the time, I'll almost remove that whole shoot, and I'll come back to the existing buds that are behind that have plumped up a little bit more and given me my volume. So that way I can keep my branch length in shape without it pushing out too far with these long shoots, and I can come back. So it's not, don't have in your head that you have to keep some of this new growth. You only keep the new growth if it falls in line with the design you've got or the plan that you've got for your cedar. Okay? It's really important, because it's a common thing that a lot of people will be going, oh, it's a new shoot, I'll just cut back to that little bud there, and suddenly everything just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you lose your structure, and it's like, oh God, where do I go from here? Like, this thing doesn't look anything like what I want it to. But if you keep in mind that it's okay to remove that spear in its entirety, if you've still got active buds behind that point, then that's a good thing, because then they will start to grow forward, but you get to keep your shape. You're not taking the tree backwards by removing it. You're keeping it where it was. But I'll reiterate again, it's got to be part of the plan to do that. If part of the plan is to thicken, to lengthen, to grow out, whatever it is, then you don't cut it like that. You sort of come back, keep some of the new needles, some of the new green growth, some of the new buds, then make your cut on that. But with a more advanced cedar, it's okay to remove it. And so just keep that in the back of your mind. So when you're pruning, you're always looking at the buds. Always. Don't go back to bare wood on these things. It'll lead to tears. always make sure that you're leaving a bud behind, unless it's one of the new shoots like I just talked about. But if it's a more advanced branch, if it's a couple of years old, look to keep buds in behind where you want to prune. Otherwise, you're going to find that it's not going to survive. So it's really important, those buds on cedars, to keep them as your primary focus. Always, one of the things I should have started this section with is always clean the unders. That's the first thing I do with almost every single tree that I work with, is clean that underneath side of the branch. Before you get in and look at structure, before you're thinning, before you're plucking, before you're doing anything with any of your trees, clean the stuff that's growing underneath the branch. If it's not part of the plan to change the angle of your branch and have it grow down naturally, then get rid of it. It's just, it's wasted resources. It's something which you're going to remove down the track anyway. So I would start all the process of cleaning any of your trees with getting rid of those unders and then move on. If you jump too far forward and say, what about this? What should this branch be cut off? Or what about that? Is that too thick? Or what about that? Is that too long? Or should I do this? Should I do that? It's like you're looking at a tree that's got to have other stuff taken off it anyway. So if you start thinning something out and go, yeah, that looks really good. Oh, hang on, now I'm going to go and do the unders. All right, start cleaning out the unders and go, oh, geez, now it's a bit thin. There's nothing really happening there. What was growing underneath the branch and coming up actually gave you your volume. Whereas, if you'd remove that first, you'd have a better idea to say, well, you know what, this is what I need to do. And especially when it comes to things like plucking your needles. Plucking your needles is about needle density. And, weaker areas, more needles makes them stronger. Stronger areas, less needles makes them a bit weaker. It's that whole set of scales, that whole balancing that we, focus on with our bonsai, with every single bonsai we work with. It's all about balancing the strong areas to the weak. Needle plucking is one of those beautiful things that we get to use. It's one of our best tools that we've got to balance resources. If you don't clean the unders out, and you start the plucking process and then you start doing the unders, it's like you're looking at something going, yeah, that balances with that one. Then you clean the unders and go, hang on a minute, now that's way too weak. I've actually removed too much off that tree because what I thought was needle volume or needle mass in that area, it's actually wasted growth coming underneath the underneath side of the branch. So anyway, that's enough talking about unders. Make sure that you start with that part first. I need to draw a breath now because I love cedars. I feel it. I feel a bit exhausted from trying to get all this out into a condensed section of this podcast. I reckon I could talk about them for a month because, like I said, they're great. The last thing I want to finish off with was one of the questions is how do you go reducing root mass on cedars because they can be temperamental? Yeah, they can. And I've seen them where, even going from bonsai pot to bonsai pot, when they're not possibly looked after the way they should be after that repotting process, not with massive amount of roots being removed, but I've seen them where they've dropped their needles basically, and they've used the new shoots pushing at the right time of year, early spring, to save the tree, because without needles these things are dead. So again, that's why it's really important with these things that you repot as they start coming out of a dormancy period into a growth period, which for me is always late winter coming into spring, because if there is a setback, if there is shock, if there is, they drop their needles, then you can use the releasing of the stored resources and the pushing of those new buds to give you the needles the tree needs to survive, to photosynthesize, to continue living. So if you'd repotted it, let's say now, coming into autumn, which is, but I see is a time that people do repot things, would it still have the same chance of survival if there was that shock that it went into? I don't think so. So for me, it's always about playing the odds and making sure that whatever you're doing is the best you can possibly do at the right time. So if you're coming from, say, a nursery pot and this was specifically the question that I got asked, if you're coming from a large black nursery pot and you want to put into a bonsai pot, they are sensitive, they are temperamental. You don't know what's happened with the tree, how long it's been in the black pot. You don't know how dense those roots are. You don't know where the key roots are on the tree. What should you do? Now, for me, it's part of a plan where you would start to look at reducing the root ball gradually and then maybe make it a planned thing. There's never a rush. There's no need to put it into a tiny little bonsai pot right now because it looks good. You want to make sure that everything you're doing is for the betterment of the bonsai, for the betterment of the tree, so this thing can live for 1,000,000 years. So if it's in, let's say a 30 centimetre pot, it might be that the first step is to bring it back to what we call an orchid pot in Australia, which, might be a shallower pot, say, 15, 20 centimetres deep, but a lot wider, so it allows for that spread of the root ball. Give it a year, 2 years in there, see how it responds. Then from there, maybe go into a slightly oversized bonsai pot. So you're reducing that root ball by 20%, 25% thereabouts. Put into a smaller bonsai pot. Keep developing the structure. Keep working on ramification. Keep needle plucking. Keep making your tree, not the nursery stock that it was when you first got it, but make it into a beautiful bonsai. And then after that, then progress to a smaller pot. I find that when you make that big jump, which some people want to do, and that's fine, but there can be a downside to it. You need to be really careful how you manage a tree after repotting. Keep it in a sheltered spot. Keep it out of the sun. Make sure it's not under pressure to get its engine going, through photosynthesis when you've gone and cut off a severe amount of the roots. Use things that will help with plant shock. There's a great one. There's a lot of them, but one plant starter that I use with them too if I'm concerned when I do the repot based on the volume of roots that have been removed. Something like that can help with plant shock, and that's something that you should investigate in your local area, because I've been told of a few that are really good ones that people swear by. So I think that would be something that I would look to do, but make it a gradual thing. Make it part of the process. Don't make it the end result straight away. So anyway, that's Cedars. If you can't tell, I've rabbited on for a fair while with this one. I love them. If you haven't got one, get 10. If you got 10, get another 10. Enjoy them. The bud conveyor. All right. How do we? This is a common thing, which I get asked, and which is a thought which goes through a lot of people's head with bonsai. You get a tree, you style it, you make it look beautiful, you take a photo, you upload it on socials, or you hang on to it and you admire it and go, "That's brilliant. That is bloody fantastic. I'm so glad my plans come together. All the hard years of work, I've got it to where I want it to be." Then it starts to grow. Spring comes around, this thing starts to look shaggy, starts to grow out, the branches start to lengthen, elongation's a term that gets dropped around the place. Everything starts to get longer. The shape starts to get lost on the tree. And it's like, how do I get back to where I was? Like that photo I had, the structure was perfect, everything looked great. Yeah, sure, it needed a bit of filling out in the pads and stuff like that, but how do I get back to there? And it's something a technique that I use, which is not new. Everybody does it that has bonsai that look the same. When you look at a photo now to, in 10 years' time, and that tree pretty much looks close to what it is. Well, but how do they do that? And it's the same technique, but the term that I've put on it is the bud conveyor. All right, so I want you to do something for me visually. Put your right hand out, palm up, away from yourself, about 30 centimetres away from your body, right? That's your main branch, all right? And then for our volume on our pads, put your second hand out, again, palm up on top of the other one, but let's say it's about 20 centimetres out, right? So that's how we get our pad volume. So you have your lower branch, which is your right arm, which is about 30 centimetres from your body, sticking out, palm up, and that gives you your tip of your pad or the length of your branch, right? And it sets the key, it sets the tone of the branch. The second branch, which is your left arm, comes out parallel on top of your other hand, about 10 centimetres up from it, about 10 centimetres back from the tip. That gives you your pad volume. So when you look at that from the side, you can visualise that's how you get your pad shape, right? Doesn't need to be 10 centimetres back and 10 centimetres up. I'm just using that as an example, whatever it is. It might be millimetres on the pad. It might be centimetres, whatever. So what the bud conveyor is, if you then take both your hands from where they're sitting now and you push them both out 10 centimetres, right? The bottom hand now has gone out too long. Like it's breached where you want the pad or the branch length to be, right? But your left hand, the one was your pad volume, now is out to the perfect length that you want your branch to be. So what you do is you cut off or you remove your right hand, push the left hand down to where it was, and then your right hand then takes the place of where your left hand was 10 centimetres back from the tip, now on top of your left hand. That's the bud conveyor. And this thing just continues like going on and on and on, where these things work in a cyclical motion where the key branch gets too long, you cut it off, the branch that's above it wires down to that position. Then the buds that are on the inner area of your volume pad, the top hand, start to grow and extend out as well. So this is where the whole concept of letting sunlight and air into those inner areas is key. It makes such a big difference to you being able to maintain your volume. I was looking at a picture the other day of a juniper, and I could see that where this thing had been designed originally, must have had a lovely shape, must have had really nice shape to it. But the tips where the branch, where the growth was, had been allowed to extend. So that branch had just got longer and longer and longer. And the overall silhouette of the tree had just got bigger and bigger and bigger. So there was nothing in that inner area. So the volume branch, the top hand that's sort of 10 centimetres back from your bottom hand, hadn't been allowed to develop. So when this tree got too long, there's nothing to cut back to. There's nothing in that inner area. So your overall bonsai loses its shape, loses its structure, loses its desire to be the bonsai that it was. So then it goes into the pile to say, okay, this thing needs a redesign because what I've got there ain't working anymore. Like there's nothing for me to continue to maintain that shape. Whereas if when you wire something, you let sunlight and air in there. When you prune something, you let sunlight and air in there. When you're plucking, when you're cutting, when you're doing anything with these trees, those inner buds. Man, I told that story a long, long time ago on the podcast about the magic bullet with bonsai, from Mr. Fujikawa in Osaka at Kokoen. Number one, watering. 100%. 100% that is correct. Second, inner buds. At the time it was like, yeah, okay. But now, like every single day, every single tree that I work on, everything I do with my bonsai, all I think about is those inner buds because of things like this bud conveyor. It makes such a big difference. What I do now, we just talked about cedars with needle plucking and pruning and shaping, and yeah, I love making them beautiful. But I know that by doing all of that stuff now, yep, sure, I can tick the box and say, I love looking at you right now. Like, you look magnificent. But I know that when those buds get too long and I look at the tree next time, I know that my bud conveyor is alive and well because of the work that I've done now, allows sunlight and air in there and allows those buds that are probably too short now, but when they extend and get to the tip of the branch that I want, I know I can cut the tip of the branch off and go, you know what, I've maintained my design integrity. I can keep the design exactly as I want it because I've done the hard work and I've kept my bud conveyor alive. So I know it's a roundabout way of saying, your pruning practices need to be spot on, your wiring needs to be spot on, your everything, fertilising, your positioning, your sun, all that stuff's got to come into play. But if you keep in mind this concept of the bud conveyor, and that's how we can avoid this lengthening of branches, and we can keep our design that we want pretty much in perpetuity, pretty much forever. We can maintain a static looking design. That's how you do it with good practices, good bonsai practices. And if you look at look at small trees, the mini stuff that comes out. It's hard with a big tree to get the grasp how to maintain the shape of a tree. But if you look at those really small ones, the only way you can possibly keep, a pine that's 15 centimetres tall, looking like a pine that's a metre tall or 100 metres tall, keep it all in perspective, is to allow that sunlight and air in there, to have that bud conveyor. So as something gets too long, cut it off, push everything back in close to the trunk, and then let the bud that's in behind it start to grow. And then as you wire and shape that one, let some sunlight into the back area of that, the bud that's behind it then starts to grow and starts to push in the bud conveyor. It's like pedals on a bike. They keep going round and round and round. As one gets too long, cuts off and gets replaced by another. As that gets too long, cuts off and replaced by another. That's the concept. I use it every day of the week. I use it every second of the day when I'm thinking about bonsai, when I'm working on bonsai, when I'm styling bonsai. And I just think it's an easy way to think of it, that conveyor belt that continually something gets replaced. That's how we maintain our design integrity and we keep that smile on our dial when we're working on our bonsai. Righto, we're into autumn/fall. Means a couple of things. Means fertilising, feeding your trees. But also means that we're coming towards pine season, which is something that I definitely need to wrap my head around. It's something that I need to prepare for and get ready for, because there's a lot of work in it. And it's not the sort of thing that I don't want to bypass it. I love it. Like, I really do. I don't mean prepare mentally as in, this is something really bad. I mean prepare mentally because, I'm going to be neck deep in needles and, my approach needs to be consistent. I need to make sure that I'm thinking about, reduction of length and making sure that I can tighten up my pads and my structure and set up things for the future. And, you've just got to be ready for it. And preparing mentally for it, for me, is one of the kickers where I get to, spend the next month or so while the weather starts to cool down. I get through, maybe even a month and a half before I truly get into it. I like to leave the last part of autumn, first part of winter for it, when I've got solid 2 months of 24/7, just plucking needles, pruning, wiring, removing wire, all that sort of stuff. So I find that if I can get myself in the headspace for it now, when I walk around my trees, that's the big time. I walk around, I look at them and go, all right, so I'm going to do this with that one. That part that's grown out long, there's buds there that are pushed out. Yeah, but there's some small ones. All right, so I'm going to cut those ones off. I'm going to bring this back. And suddenly in my head, I start to see the vision of where I want this tree to be when I finish working with it. And I lock that away in the database, in the vault, and go, yep, okay, cool. So move on. That one's okay. Next one. What am I going to do with this one? It looks shaggy. All right, so if I cut this, if I wide that here, if I did this, if I did that, and I can sort of, rather than just plopping these things on the work table in front of me on the trolley and going, right, what am I going to do with it? It's like my plan. I can go through the plan in my head and go, you remember with that one, we're going to leave that sacrifice, that little bud there that's growing, that's the one I'm going to leave alone. Or no, we're going to cut that sacrifice off now, it's done too much. Whatever it is, I can get myself mentally ready for these things. And I love it when I'm having my coffee, walk around. I don't go through every single pine I've got every single day. But as I look at them, if there's one that's daunted me or that's been on the path of a plan for a long time, I love spending that extra couple of minutes with it and, just going, all right, so what was I going to do with this one? Oh, that's right. This one here needs to develop more, but that's ready now. Now I can start to see the apex is going to form nicely on that one. That branch is coming off. It's becoming a gin. I'm going to do whatever. I'm going to carve the part of the trunk on whatever it is. I find that by allowing myself to get into that space now, I can really maximize my return that I'm going to put into the trees, and it is good to spend this, let's call it late spring, early autumn, going through and making sure that I've got everything ready. In the podcast next week, I'm going to start talking about fertilizing, because it's that time. Right, it's time for us to start making the neighbours angry with the smell of blood and bone in the backyard. But I want to talk specifically about pines and when to fertilise them, and specifically Japanese black pines, okay? Because and necessarily all of them, because there's still that little bit of growing period, and getting into fertilising too early can have a detrimental effect and destroy the hard work that you've done from late last year when you decandled the trees, if you decandle them. But there's also a chance for us, for those that maybe are a little bit weaker, that probably didn't respond as well as what they should have with decandling, to give them a bit of a nudge. So I'm going to talk about that next week in the podcast, because it's too much to talk about. It'll make this podcast go for about 3.5 hours, I'd reckon. So I want to talk about it. But yeah, this section, it's time. If you've got pines, then you've got a busy time coming up if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. It's something that you need to start getting ready for and start enacting the plan. Don't wait till you've got the tree in front of you to think about it. You might not have 100 pines like I do, so it might not be quite as in depth as what I am. But you need to. I think it's time to pull a plan out that you've got for the trees. Has it responded the way that you wanted to? What are you going to do with it when you get to sit down in front of this thing and make it look magnificent, or take the next step in its design evolution? And that's all done right now. And just like that, we're done. Thank you for sticking around if you've made it this far. I do appreciate it. Thank you to the subscribers. I know I say it every time, but I do. I love you. I really do. A couple of things to wrap up. A couple of things I've been doing around the yard lately too is potting up cuttings. And I don't know why I'm taking cuttings, because I vowed to myself I wouldn't, but I have been. I've been taking cuttings. One that comes to mind was I took a batch of Shimpaku juniper cuttings recently around December and put them just jammed them into little pots. So it didn't look like much on the bench. It was like, whatever. It's just little cuttings, couple of little pots there, 3 pots, not much. Looked at them all, picked up the pots the other day. Roots were coming out the bottom of the pots. I went, oh, well, there you go. Some have taken, so it's time to put them into their own pots. Works out that I took 31 cuttings, and of the 31 rooted. So now I've got 31 of these small pots, which doesn't sound like much now, but it takes a hell of a lot more room on the bench. But also means there's 31 juniper cuttings that are going to turn into bonsai somewhere down the track that need work, that need wiring, that need styling. And I sort of slapped myself on the forehead as I did it and went, why didn't you take 10? 10 would have been much better than 31. But anyway, that's what I've been doing around the yard. So if you have taken cuttings, it's a really, I find now as we head into this cooler period where you don't have the extreme smack of the high 30s and temperature extremes, it's a good time to try and shuffle your cuttings into their own pots, let the roots establish a little bit and not together. Because if you've got, I jammed them all into tiny little pots. So if I'd left them, those roots would have become entangled and it'd be a nightmare trying to separate them. I'd do more damage than good. But as it was, good structure of roots for each of the trees. They fell apart nice and easy and can put them in pots and off they go. So that's what's been happening around the yard. The other thing I want to do is do a bit of a plug too for a bonsai show that's coming up. It's one of my favourite, to be honest. I would love to be attending this year. I'd love to have a tree on show in there, but I'm not available, unfortunately. It's the Victorian Native Bonsai Exhibition. One of my favourite. I bang on about using natives as bonsai. No matter where you are in the world, I thoroughly believe that the native species that especially grow around your area should be something that become and form part of your collection. Again, reiterate, don't style a native that doesn't grow like a black pine to make it look like a black pine. I don't like that. Personal opinion, you can if you want, it's up to you. But it's hard to find shows specifically dedicated to native species in your local area. And this Victorian Native Bonsai Club is this, I don't mean to upset anybody else around the country, but I reckon they're groundbreaking with what they've done. I love the online database they've got for their members on different species. I love the focus that they have purely on natives. That's it. It's all it's about. It doesn't mean they have to be the 100%, of your collection. They become part of your collection. But to go and see our Australian natives in some of their most magnificent forms that you possibly can, and maybe open your eyes to new variety, new species that are available. This thing, the Victorian Native Bonsai Club show, is the one to get along to. So they've got a Friday night on the 15th of March and then Saturday the 16th of March during the whole day. But if you get along, I reckon it's a great one to have a look at. So Victorian Native Bonsai Club, if you just search their website, you'll find the details. But 15th and 16th of March, it's definitely one worth getting along to. Anyway, folks, that's it. I do appreciate your patronage. I love the fact that I see the stats come through for this podcast and how far and wide it reaches, and it means a hell of a lot to me. It's nice that there's so many bonsai lovers out there that connect, and that the feedback from last week's yak with Oscar too from Bonsai Empire was so well received. I really enjoyed it. I thought it's a nice insight to bonsai around the rest of the world. You can look a bit microscopic sometimes, and to hear someone talk about it with who's got his finger on the pulse everywhere around the world, and what potentially new can be happening. It's really interesting. So if you haven't listened to that one, jump back. It's a previous episode for 2024. You'll find it there. But anyway, thank you very much. Enjoy this time as we sort of start to head towards a really busy time if you've got pines. Like I said, get yourself mentally prepared for it because it's coming, and spend some time with your trees. Reenact your plan that you've got for your trees. I think that's a key driver for me that I try and push is having a plan and making sure that you're on top of it every step of the way. Thanks for sticking around. Until next time, as always, happy bonsai.